you want to play it safe when capitalizing on events that have like almost nothing to do with what you do and are.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 334, and we're going to talk about trends, music marketing, and how to leverage trends and how not to leverage trends and the news to promote your music, to engage your fans, and to grow your fan base. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy, and with me, as always, is Circa. And I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion, something we haven't talked about on the show before. You and I have, I think, similar and also diverging viewpoints on this that'll be fun to talk about. And generally speaking, it's a question that I've gotten a lot over the years when I'm talking to artists and bands about things going on social media. Social media is kind of an extension of like humans communicating and talking to one another. And so when things are happening in the news, in the world, in their local communities, I've gotten questions from artists that are like, oh, XYZ political thing is happening, and I have a song that's about that. How can I promote it? How can I talk about this? Oh, there's this social cause going on that's really, important to me, and there's a lot of people talking about it right now. How do I use my music video to capitalize on that? Questions like that come up all the time, and I think now is probably a better time than ever with an election coming up here in the US to talk about ways to leverage trendjacking, as I like to call it, or newsjacking is the term that I actually learned years ago from Ryan Dice from Digital Marketer, who kind of put this seed in my brain. I think it'll be good to talk about trendjacking, newsjacking, when it's good to use, ways that it's good to use, and the more subtle art of doing it effectively, both outside of like major world events, political events, and more of the subtle ways of just picking up on things that you like, that inspire you, that are trending, and using them to grow your fan base.
Yeah, it's interesting because like this is an issue where I fall on like two sides. Like in the context in which you originally learned it, for digital marketers, I think it's like absolutely appropriate. I think musicians more often run the risk of I think it's harder for musicians to execute this in a way that's tasteful, right? Like for me, like if you're going to create art because there was some news event, like I think you shouldn't. Whereas like if you're going to create content about some news event, I think you totally can, as long as it's like immediate and recent. So it's like a really fine line with this one. We may not fall on the same side on this one.
No, that's especially a good point because generally, strategically speaking, our recommendations when it comes to content is that your content is tied to your art. So if we're talking about making art that is, related to a current event or something going on in the news or a trend, and that's kind of like cheesy or faux pas, then by transitive property, like if your content is supposed to be tied to your art, then the same rule kind of applies to the content, except when it doesn't.
Yeah.
So you're right. I do think that that's really challenging. I think artists do have it harder. I'm not usually one to say like artists have it harder than other businesses, but I do agree with you that this is one of those cases where it can come off really contrived. It can come off very cheesy. Think about how many, actually, I can think of a really good example of like cheesy, contrived art and music and content. When Hurricane Katrina happened, I remember there being tons of songs and artists talking about it. And I just remember like so much awful music coming out of Hurricane Katrina relief. That's just like an example of like a news event or a world event, a catastrophe in the United States, where I remember being like, oh, this is a huge eye roll and all of this sucks and it's awkward and doesn't feel good, feels icky. And I think that that's a really good example that's not as recent, where I can kind of look back at it and be like, yeah, this is a good example of like newsjacking or trendjacking that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Also like it's like we see it a lot. Like we hear from musicians who are like, oh, this just happened, or I'm somehow related to this. this event, or like, I have opinions about this event. Like, what should I do to capitalize on it? And it's like, well, number one, like, I think you want to play it safe when capitalizing on events that have like almost nothing to do with what you do and are. That said, like, I think the safest place to play in is like, if you're an artist who already uses like humor in your content, for instance, like, former Entrepreneur staff team member and current Entrepreneur team member, Michael Kessler and Jesse Gillenwalters, like, they're hilarious. They have a funny podcast. A lot of their content is like really humorous.
Yeah.
And for them, like, if some event happens and they make a piece of content on it that's funny, I can't imagine a scenario where that's going to hurt them unless it's like some tragic event.
Yeah.
So like, there are contexts in which it's a lot safer to play. I find that, and maybe this is just a personal taste thing, but I find that artists who are a lot more preachy or causey, I see them often be like, oh, I should say something about this. And I'm like, maybe you don't. Like,
Yeah.
maybe don't do that. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. And I think this is a great place to start talking about the reasons why not to and examples of it. Because comedy is a really great example of places where like comedians are kind of like the safety zone. artistic comedians especially, like, you kind of have full license to make fun of anything and everything.
Yeah.
And some people might argue with me that like woke culture is ruining comedy, but like, I'm just going to roll my eyes at you and say that, you know, comedy is still, relatively speaking, a pretty safe place to make fun of anything going on in the news all the time. But you're right in that, like, for the more serious types, saying something before news event or trend has played itself out fully tends to lead to like foot in mouth, you know?
Rather, like, I'll say that, like, if you haven't, like, I think you have to earn the right to newsjack.
Mm.
You know what I mean? It's like, this should not be your like a thing you were trying to fix all of these other problems with like your music career, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It should not be like something that's going to like present a sea change. If it's an opportunity to create content that belongs in a litany, a lineage of other really intentional content. And by content, I mean like short form videos on Instagram and TikTok, right? Or it might be like an email to your email list, right? Like, it shouldn't be the thing that's supposed to change your circumstances.
Dude, that's good. Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that. And I think that when questions come up about like, how do I capitalize on that? That's immediately a flag in my mind when I hear things like that. It's like, oh, you have other infrastructure problems with your marketing that probably need to be fixed if you're asking something like that.
Yeah.
And this leads into nicely, I think, the more subtle types of trendjacking. And I intentionally call it trendjacking because it's less about news or events going on around the world or current events than it is about like trends and inspiration that are going on online. And I think this is where a bit more of a subtle look is useful. And then we'll get into a bit more of the on the nose effect of it, which goes a little bit further down the funnel. When it comes to trendjacking and how I think you can leverage it effectively in music is about looking at trends in content that inspire you and then interpolating them into something that feels authentic to you, that feels like something that you can repeatedly do on an ongoing basis. And this is really just about content creation. It's about being inspired by the stuff that you see, other creatives, other artists, different people online, and then making something on the back of that inspiration. I'll give an example from one of our agency clients, a band that I work with directly as a strategist. They found themselves inspired a while back by a piece of content on TikTok. They saw another band make a piece of content, and it was like very unknown. It wasn't viral at all, actually. Like, it had gotten like a little bit of views, but they were like, "Oh, I really dig what this group did. We should try making something like that." And they did, and they took something and put their own spin on it. And what happened was their spin on it became something totally new and it went viral. And then they created a whole series around it. And that's been continuing to be a kind of core piece of their content strategy ongoing ever since. This was quite a long time ago. And so that's an example of they saw an opportunity with, a trend, and it actually was a trend that wasn't even super popular yet. It was something that had been shared by like a few creators that they saw on TikTok. And they were like, oh, we kind of dig this. Like, it seems like there might be some traction here. Let's try putting our own spin on it. And that can work really, really well. That's an example from the agency. I think something you can compare this to as well for like content creation and top of funnel is you see duets happen a lot where artists will duet on super popular songs or trending songs, and they'll add their own verse, or they'll add a guitar solo or a drum part or something like that. You see that sort of thing happen all the time. And I'm actually typically pretty impressed by those types of content pieces. Maybe I'm just a sucker for like that kind of creativity where somebody's like riffing on a verse or throwing in a drum solo. I think that kind of stuff is really cool. I actually saw a piece of content recently from a bass player. I don't remember the band's name right now. I'll have to link to it in the show notes if I can find it again. But it's a bass player, and he's grabbing like trending songs and putting like prog bass over it. And the whole hook is like, when you're thinking a second thought about hiring the math rock bassist for your XYZ band. And I love his videos. I think they're so super good. And I think that kind of thing is an example of trendjacking that can work really well. Listening and paying attention to music that is popular right now and finding ways to interpolate and use, that content as a launch pad for your content strategy.
Yeah, I think that's great, right? Like if there's an artistic reason to get involved, or again, like if you're humorous, like kind of like have free reign, if there's a really good reason. I think that all too often though, like and this is because of like past music marketery types in the space, like have recommended like just go jack memes and like other things and news events and like work that into all your content and stuff. And yeah, that just makes me a little hesitant, but there are definitely instances where it's like, go right ahead. When it fits, it can be really powerful. That's not to say that like, oh, like if it works, like you can do it. Like, no, if it fits, like it can actually be like huge. But if it doesn't fit, it's not only not going to be huge, but it could potentially be embarrassing, and it could potentially be like just further ingraining the wrong mindset that like what you need is some hack instead of like really fundamentals, like everything we talk about on this podcast, like the fundamental boring stuff that everyone tells you to do. It's just like working out and eating right. Like, yeah, dude, like if you go into the gym and lift weights, you will be strong over time. If you eat less than you burn, you will weigh less over time. Like it's very boring and obvious.
Yeah.
That's the way to get ahead, is boring, obvious stuff most of the time. But if you can work this into your execution of that boring, obvious stuff, and it makes it easier for you, it can be very powerful.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that is a good point to make around the next sort of area that I'm going to talk about, which I think is, again, a bit more subtle, where this goes less into thinking about trends and more just into thinking about timing and what's collectively going on in your area or your country or the world. Subtly speaking, trendjacking falls into sales promotions and bottom of funnel work just as much as it does top of funnel. And what I mean to say, and this is such an easy lever to pull, and it actually does apply to like the boring work and the infrastructure. Like we talk about this plenty on the show, but I think it bears repeating in this context, is like when Black Friday is something that's going on and it's quote unquote trending, you're seeing ads for Black Friday for all different kinds of brands and companies and anything you can imagine, really. You should probably jump on that trend, because that means that people, your fans, your customers, are in buying mode. There's deal consciousness going on. And that's the kind of trend that you do want to jump on. Yeah. It's a little different, comparatively speaking, if you want to go the to the other end of the extreme, if there's a major world event or a catastrophe, you don't need to make a t-shirt for every one of those and then try to capitalize on it,
Yeah, 100%. Again, like, it's a strategy that I would say it directly applies to your social media videos and maybe your emails. If you send an email a week to your email list, which you should, it can nicely fit into there. Like, that's your place to actually say something about current events to the people who care about your music career. It's totally a great place for it.
Yep.
And it just helps you write, the weekly email faster because you can like talk about how you actually feel about a subject. But if you're putting it into social media content, short form videos, yeah, like it fits as like either a skit or a funny like aside. It also can fit as like its own content driven musical piece. And what I mean by that is that if you have a current event, especially if you're like you have a humorous brand and you're like, all right, my music is serious. I make serious music, but for this piece of content, I'm going to make a song that plays on this because I think it's funny. Like, that's a golden opportunity to make something a little extra special.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is interesting. I think we actually aligned on this topic more than we might have thought going into the episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope that everything we've kind of talked about here sort of outlines the fine lines and the subtleties of this, because it really is, like you said it well, Cirque. There's a fine line, and I think the most critical thing that you can do as an artist when you start having these wonderings and these questions of like, how do I capitalize on something going on or a trend that I like or that interests me, is you need to ask yourself, am I doing this to try to fill a gap or plug a hole in my strategy? Or am I just seeing a cool opportunity that fits nicely and appropriately on top of all the things that I'm already doing? And if you can answer that question for yourself in a way that is satisfactory and fits, then you probably have some work you can do and something that you can really dig into and try to make something cool. If you can't and you're still sort of left wondering, then that tells me a lot about, and maybe you should just set that aside for now.
Agreed, dude. I'm on board with that.
I love it. I hope this gives everybody a little bit of strategic thinking, a bit of a brain dump from me and Cirque, some insight into stories and conversations that we've had with artists at the agency over the years about this topic, especially as we're at least in the US, a bit of a politically heated time. And there's certainly been plenty of chatter on the internet about all sorts of things, from politics to the...
Wait, there's political heat?
What are you talking about, man?
What do you mean, dude?
The Olympics, all sorts of things going on. And sometimes there's a place for you to fit that into your content strategy, and other times there's not.
Sometimes there just ain't.
I actually had a really funny conversation today with one of our agency clients. We had a demo today. We were looking over their organic content on TikTok, which they go viral a lot. And their more recent videos haven't been popping off as much. And we were just talking about like the reasons why. And I was like, there has been a lot going on in the world these last few weeks. That could have something to do with it. And they were like, yeah, have you read anything about that? Like, is there any information? And I'm like, no, but there's plenty of experience behind what I'm about to say to you, that like people are behaving differently on the internet a little bit in the last month compared to how they usually do. And I was like, if you guys really want to shake up your algorithm a little bit, you could incorporate some red hats and some blue t-shirts into your content strategy. And they were like, yeah, I think we're
going to hold off on that,
actually. And obviously I was joking when I said that, but maybe that gives you guys a little bit to think about when you're also analyzing what might be going on in your own strategy right now. And if you're questioning why your content is or isn't doing as well as it might usually do, just remember that the things going on in the world can have a big effect on how people think about what you're putting out there.
Yeah, 100%.
So we'll close off with that. Think about ways that you guys can incorporate trendjacking into your own music in ways that are subtle and cool and fit you. And if you can't find ways that are subtle and cool and fit you, then maybe leave trendjacking to the side. And I'll answer to Ryan Dice for that. We'll catch you guys next time on Creative Juice. Peace out, Indy.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the sweat?